Hello everyone, my name is Jamie Taylor and I want to talk to you about some of the lessons that I've learnt the hard way during my first 3 years of podcasting. The slides that you're looking at now over there are available on GitHub, but the link was way too long, so I've bit.lyfied it. Hopefully that link will still work. I'll make sure that it's getting shared before we even start. So there you go. But before we start the topic of the actual talk, I want to say a big thank you to NE-RPC and the organisers, because if it weren't for the folks organising it and creating this event, then we wouldn't have the event, right? We wouldn't have the event, then I wouldn't be speaking to you now about podcasting, and all of the other wonderful people that you've listened to and will be looking forward to listen to today wouldn't have had a chance to talk about their topics. So thank you to the organisers, thank you to the speakers, and thank you to you for wanting to listen to me waffle on about podcasting, right? So what are we going to cover? Well, I've tried to plan this out such that each of these points will be answered within the next 20 minutes. Just because, I want you to be able to go away from this and have some thoughts in your head as to how to start a show or how to improve your show. But the biggest thing is that there's not a huge amount of time available, but there is a huge amount of detail. So feel free to pull down the slides. There's lots of slide notes. I'm actually looking at them now on this screen that has the camera attached to it. And feel free to get in contact with me over Twitter, if you have Twitter, at podcasterj or .NET Core Show. If you don't have Twitter, then after this is all done, find me in the chat system and we'll talk about whatever you want to talk about. But first, what is a podcast, right? Well, technically anything with a public-facing RSS or a RSS feed that can be subscribed to by a subset of the public is a podcast, or at least a podcast feed. The podcast feed doesn't have to just feed audio. It can feed audio, video, images, binary blobs, PDFs, documents, just links, whatever you want. And you may be saying to yourself, but Jamie, that's not a podcast, that's a blog. Or that's not a podcast, that's an email. That's not a podcast, that's just an RSS feed. Well, it's not just me that thinks this. The VP of Podcaster Relations at Libsyn, the largest podcast host on the planet, is called Rob Walsh, and that is his description of what a podcast is, right? So you don't have to just serve audio, you can serve whatever you want. But who am I, right? I'm sitting here talking to you about podcasting, but who am I? Well, I'm a .NET developer, and I've run 3 podcasts, but I've been involved in 5 so far, and a few others that have failed to start, and that's where I've learned all these lessons. So top row left to right is Waffling Taylor's .NET Core Show and Tabs and Spaces. Bottom row left to right is Dev Otaku and Ask a Brit. So Waffling Taylor's is silliness about video games. .NET Core Show is all about .NET Core. Tabs and Spaces is me and 2 of my programmer friends talking about some of the things we've witnessed in the programming experience. Going from not being a programmer to being a programmer, and all of the business things that you witness, all of the culture things that you witness. Dev Otaku is an attempt at getting people to chill, step away from being a tech worker and focus on something fun to do or something silly to do. Season 1 is all of Cowboy Bebop. Ask a Brit is the brainchild of my friend Jay Miller, and that is essentially him asking me about things that we do in Britain that they don't do in America. And we talk about the differences and the similarities. But yeah, that's who I am. I'm a podcast host for 5 podcasts. Shortly before recording, I double-checked how much audio that I've actually released to the public, and it's in the region of 135 hours. So I have a little bit of experience. So how do you get started with a podcast, right? You had this brilliant idea. I'll make a podcast, get my name out there. Everyone will know me. I'll be stupidly famous, and I'll make loads of money, right? Well, first of all, it starts with an idea. If you don't have an idea, you haven't got a show. There is a line from a TV show from the 90s called Seinfeld, where one of the characters, George Costanza, says, "It's a show about nothing." Now, the problem is that works because it's kind of silly to say, but that's not going to work for a podcast, right? No one's going to tune in, week out, month in, month out, and listen to you talk about nothing. So you need an idea of what your show's going to be about. But what you're going to actually need to do is come up with a bunch of ideas, because without a large list of ideas, you can't whittle them down. So I would start with vague ideas and work your way to some very specific ideas. Once you've got that, you can then listen to a whole bunch of shows that you already listen to and like, or that you know of and like. Maybe you're not a podcast listener, but you want to create a podcast. Well, go and find a bunch of shows in and around the niche that you want to target. If you're really lucky and there isn't a niche, then fantastic, you can create your own rules. But if the niche exists, then there'll be conventions, rules, and memes that you should stick to, because these are the things that the listeners are going to want to expect from your show. Make notes of the things that you like, make notes of the things you dislike. And, you know, the sincerest form of flattery is imitation, right? So copy what you are seeing and make your own version of it. Because that's what you're going to want to do for the first few. Getting the hardware is not a problem at this point. You are still spitballing ideas. Once you have the ideas, then we'll move on to another step, and then we'll move on to the hardware, right? So you've got the ideas, next is the plan. Now, you're going to want to plan everything out. You're going to want to come up with something that looks like a plan, because otherwise you're not going to actually get anywhere. Trust me, I know this. There is a phrase in the army, it comes from the British Army, the American Army, that is called the 6 Ps. This is prior planning prevents something poor performance. I've censored myself there because I don't want to say exactly what it is. But without planning it out, you're not going to get anywhere. As an example, for the .NET Core podcast, I planned 16 episodes before I even recorded anything. I came up with the idea of the show, and I sat at Starbucks with this laptop, fired up Visual Studio Code, and start typing in Markdown what I wanted for the first 16 episodes. As a listener, what do I want? Not as Jamie the producer, as a listener. If someone was to produce this show, what would I want to hear? Having that plan means that you can come up with loads of ideas for episodes, and that means that you can have episode ideas that just sit on the shelf on the back burner that you never actually use for the first 5-6 episodes for the first year, right? You don't actually have to use them, which is brilliant. Without a plan, you're essentially saying, I want to get a tattoo, but I don't know what tattoo I want, right? You don't want a tattoo, you just want the prestige of having one, right? You don't want to mark your body with it, but let's move on, right? Once you have the plan and the idea, you can think about hardware. Now, if you have a laptop, then you have a built-in mic array. Usually they're either by the sides of the keyboard or near the top of the keyboard behind the screen. Now, if you have a MacBook Pro 16, the shiny new one, that comes with a podcast quality mic array. I don't know what that means. I have used one, and the audio is better than most mic arrays in laptops, but not as good as a discrete mic. I keep pointing here. This is a microphone that I'm using at the moment that is just off camera. I like to keep the microphone off camera because you don't want to see the microphone, and as you can tell, I'm waving my hands around. You don't want to hear me thwacking the microphone with my hands. So all you really need is a laptop and a pair of headphones, and you are away from a hardware perspective. So get some headphones, because when you're editing, you want to hear the sound going in here. You don't want to rely on the sound around you, because otherwise you're not going to be able to actually edit it properly, not unless you have some very powerful speakers that can override the sound around you. So key point, don't waste time getting any hardware at the beginning, right? Best will in the world, and I wish for your podcast idea to succeed. I sincerely do, but it may not succeed. And if you spend 200, 300, 400, 500 pounds on hardware, you've spent that for something that you're never going to use again. So it can be repurposed. Maybe you get into live streaming. Maybe you record audiobooks. Maybe you just record a bunch of video tutorials. I don't know. But get the idea first before spending money on hardware. But let's say you do want to spend money on hardware and you want to buy a microphone. Do you go dynamic or do you go condenser? The short answer is yes. And the reason for that is because it will all depend on the area that you're recording in, the number of people you're recording, whether everyone gets the right microphone, whether you're okay with just having one by your mouth here, the sort of gamer mic, or whether there's a lot of background noise, whether you're in a small room, a big room, whether you can set up blankets and cushions to soften the sound. But the rule of thumb is that there are two different types of microphones, a dynamic mic and a condenser mic. They're named because of the way that the actual audio pickup part of the mic works. The dynamic mics will typically pick up less background noise. This isn't always the case, but they will typically pick up less background noise. Condenser mics will typically pick up all of the background noise. Now, as an example, I am using a dynamic mic to record my audio portion of this. Because I'm using the dynamic mic, you shouldn't be able to hear my MacBook Air's passive cooling system or my desktop computer's cooling system. Now, my desktop computer's on just because it's running some numbers and doing some folding at home, but you shouldn't be able to hear that ticking away. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. Audio from dynamic mics require gain before they go in, so they maybe require a preamp, maybe require a mixing desk. Condenser mics, not so much, but again, it depends on the area, it depends on how much reflective surfaces you have, all that kind of stuff. And then the next question is, do I go USB or XLR? Again, the answer is yes, or rather the answer is make it as simple as possible. If you have a USB port on your computer and you're going to use your computer, get a USB microphone. If you have a mixing desk laying around, or if you have a piece of hardware like in the slide on there that only takes XLR input, then use XLR microphones, whatever makes it easiest for you. If you don't know what XLR is, it's that funky format that the audio engineers in music and radio and TV have used for decades, and it looks like 3 pins like this with a circle around it. You'll see what I mean in the next slide. But yeah, make it easy. Make it easy on yourself. You can move up to XLR if you want, but get started with the USB because it's easy to set up, right? The U in USB means universal. Easy. Okay. Hardware versus software recording. I use hardware to record, and I don't mean my laptop. I use one of those, which is an Zoom H6. That allows me to plug in everybody's microphones, hit record, and it will record all of those tracks for me onto individual files, so then I have no problem with separating anyone's audio out. The last thing you want is for 2 people to be talking and one person to be like stretching or scratching or clapping or yawning, because if you're recording both tracks at once into one file, you can't get rid of that background noise. If you're recording as 2 separate tracks and I start clapping or I start yawning or I start singing or someone interrupts me, you can mute me whilst you're talking. Useful. It's called a double ender. We'll come to that in a moment. So software recording is a great place to start. Plug the microphone in, bring up Audacity, hit record, and you're done. That's actually how I started with the .NET Core Show. The Waffling Tailors podcast started in GarageBand. If you have a Mac or some kind of Apple hardware, you get GarageBand for free, so you don't have to pay for anything. I use Audacity all of the time because it's free. It is buggy, but it is free. It sometimes crashes, sometimes doesn't. You have to hit save a lot, but don't worry about that too much for now. You can use Discord as long as you install a bunch of plugins. You can use CleanFeed and Squadcast and Zencaster to set up SaaS style recording, where you just send someone a link, they sign into the link, and as long as they've got their podcast microphone plugged in and they're ready to go, it will all just work. Skype has add-ons for recording calls, but they're not great, is how I'll put it. Because Skype is not great, is how I'll put it. But yeah, hardware recorders are the best. Having everyone record their own audio, which is what's called a double ender, will be the best take that you can get. That is where if you and I are recording a podcast episode, I'll ask you to record your audio from your microphone in Audacity or GarageBand or whatever, and I will record mine. We'll synchronize at the beginning with me saying 3, 2, 1, and then we both go like that. I'll synchronize the signal when we're done, and we're good to go. You send me that audio when we've recorded. Brilliant. That's the best way to get the best quality audio. There's no compression, there's no any kind of artifacts. Excellent. Talking of that, we're talking about editing. Now, editing will take a very, very long time, especially when you're first starting. When you're first starting, for every 30 minutes of audio that you record, you're going to be looking at about 60 minutes to edit it. So that's it's going to edit time of double, and that is if assuming that you listen to it at one speed, because it will take you, the reason it takes you 60 minutes is because it takes you at least 30 minutes to listen through to it. And then occasionally you go, oh, I don't like that bit, chop that out. Oh, I don't like that bit, bring up the equalization levels. Oh, that needs to be louder, that needs to be quieter. We need to think about something to put behind here. Maybe there's some Creative Commons music I can put there, or maybe we need a ding sound, or maybe we just take that whole thing out. That 30 minutes is going to take you an hour, right? Because that post-production process takes a long time. And that's why post-production experts and audio editors charge as much as they do. And they charge a lot. But you may find that you really enjoy doing post-production and audio editing. Fantastic. If you do, brilliant. But the key thing to remember when you're editing is that garbage audio in will produce garbage audio coming out. If your audio is garbage going in, it's not going to sound good. So try with the previous step of with that hardware, try and do a double ender if you can. Try and use the highest quality hardware you can for the budget that you have, and it'll all be good. With that said, with the timing, you really don't believe me. I can tell, and I'm doing this as a video, that you don't believe me that it's going to take me twice as long to edit audio than it does to listen to it. But it really does. And a pro tip here that we're going to go into in a minute is render everything to mono. Unless you use a stereoscopic sound for your production, maybe you're creating an audio drama, unless you're using stereoscopic sound, you do not need to produce audio produce audio in stereo, sorry. By producing audio in stereo, you're using twice as much bandwidth to serve half as much content, right? The only show that I can think of that's not an audio drama that requires that stereoscopic sound is a show called .NET Rocks, because what they do is they have the guest sitting so that they have the show produced so that when you're listening, the guest is here and they're talking away. They're in both channels. They appear audio wise, they appear here, and each of the hosts appear there. And the reason for that, when you're listening, I'll just bring my arms in so you can see, right? The reason why the hosts appear just here and the guest appears there is because when you're listening to it and you close your eyes, it's like you're sitting around a table and having a 4-person conversation, and you can look around and see who's talking and that kind of thing, right? So you really don't need stereo. Split that out, drop your file sizes by half, less for you to upload, which means it's more than likely cheaper for you to host, and less for your fans to download. Now rendering, you probably can't see this image very well because it's not showing very well in my preview, but we have 3 sets of file properties here. Left to right, we've got the raw files for an episode of Tabs and Spaces, which totals 2.1 gigabytes. We've got the rendered WAV file, which is all of that episode with all the post-production done as a WAV file in stereo, 352.9 megabytes, and then the rendered mono MP3, 48 megabytes. Render to mono always. And here's why. The left hand side of this image is the mono version of that same episode, 48 megabytes, roughly. The stereo version is 80 megabytes. Not a huge difference when you're on Wi-Fi, when you're plugged into the wall. But when you're on cellular and you're listening with your phone, or when you're having to download and you're maybe in a different country and you're paying a lot for roaming charges, those extra 32 megabytes is quite a lot. In fact, that's another episode of the podcast that you've lost out on, right? So maybe think about that. Release cadence. Now, the thing about release cadence, the thing about new projects with release cadences is we all get excited. We want to release all the things to the people as much as we can because it's exciting to be making this new thing. Okay, let's say you release 4 episodes a week. Can you keep that up? Can you keep that cadence up in 2 months? Can you keep that cadence up in 6 months? Can you keep it up in 18 months? Are you able to continually release this stuff that often? Maybe you haven't given up your job. Maybe you're still working full time. Maybe you have a child and you've got childcare to deal with. What if you get sick? Whatever that worst case scenario in your family could be, in your current living situation could be, what if that happens? Don't want to scare anyone, but if that happens, are you still able to produce the content? Probably not. This happened to not this specifically, but a situation similar to this happened to a podcaster called Helen Zaltzman a number of years ago. She contracted laryngitis, which meant she couldn't speak. So she couldn't record new episodes to release, right? So what she did was she contacted a bunch of podcasters that she respected and trusted and asked them to create some episodes that were like guest episodes. So that could be a thing that you could look into. But if you were releasing 4 times a week, can you keep that up? And if not, then maybe you shouldn't release 4 times a week, because the cadence that you set now when you start your show, that you keep going, is the cadence that your listeners, your fans, the community will expect from you. And when you don't release a new episode, they will come to you and say, are you okay? What's going on? Is there something we can help with? So that's really important. And a side note to this, Apple Podcasts. Every podcatching service on the planet pulls from Apple Podcasts, except for Google Podcasts. Submit your show to Apple Podcasts 1 whole month before you're ready to announce to the world that your podcast is ready, because it will take at least that long. They have this submission process they go through, they check a bunch of stuff, and if they don't like it, they won't tell you why, they will not accept it. And it can take up to a month, so make sure that you do that with lots of time to spare. That being said, let's talk about release dates. Unless you're creating a current affairs show or a news show or a show that is related to a TV show which is currently being broadcasted, or some sporting event that's going on, then there is no perfect day to release your show. This is something that comes up a lot with people that I talk to when they say, which day should I release my show on? And I say to them, the day that you are happy to release your show on. If you can make it so that you can release an episode of your show every Monday, or every month on a Monday, or every 2 weeks on a Monday, or every Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday, then do that, right? It's all about what fits around your schedule, right? You don't want to be sitting there at 4 o'clock in the morning pulling your hair out because you can't get this bit of the edit done because it's going to take 3 hours and the new episode needs to go out in 2 hours. You don't want to be in that situation. Set yourself a cadence and a release day and a release date that works for your schedule. And remember that podcasts are consumed on demand. Even if you release it on Tuesday, most people may not listen till Wednesday or Thursday. If you release it Tuesday at 9 o'clock in the morning, UK time, that means that for our American friends, you're going to have to wait 4, 5, 6 hours for them to even be awake. For our East Asian friends, that means you're going to have to wait until tomorrow for them to hear it, because it's likely late in the afternoon into the evening in some parts of the world. So you're going to have to pick a time that works for you and just damn the torpedoes and just release it and not worry about it's been 5 minutes and no one's downloaded it. Firstly, podcast stats don't work like that. They update every few hours, so you don't have to worry about that. And secondly, time zones are a thing. Just like cadence, set a day and a time that you can maintain, and then automate and schedule as much as you can, right? Automating things really helps. We know that from the CI/CD, the DevOps area of our business, that if you automate it, it makes it easier. Pod fading is a thing that happens, unfortunately, to a lot of shows. We're seeing it a lot during COVID-19 lockdown. We're going to see it as the lockdown ends and we go back to normal life. A personal opinion, we may not get to normal, but that's personal opinion, nothing to do with this. When a show disappears after only releasing a few episodes, it is known as pod fading. A few can mean different numbers to different people. Some shows naturally end after 6 episodes because there's nothing else to say. Some shows can reach 21, 25, 30, 40 episodes and then just drop off the map. Pod fading to most people means around 21 episodes. If you can get past 21 episodes, you are good. You can literally call that a season and be done. Some people release 6 episodes and stop because that's the end of the story, because it's a serial podcast that needs to be listened to in that order, and then you reach a logical stopping point. Usually a podcast fades because someone starts out and doesn't realize how much effort there's required to maintain that episode or that show. It's just like when people join the gym on the 1st of January, right? By the 2nd of February, most of those people who have joined have stopped going. They're still paying, but they've stopped going. How do you beat that? How do you beat pod fading? Well, you plan and you schedule and you have a bank of rendered episodes that are ready to go. Because that way, if you fall ill or if something happens, you can keep producing the content from the listener's point of view. Now, this is the hairy, scary one for me because I'm not a lawyer, right? And I don't claim to be. You may require the services of a lawyer to get your podcast up and running, depending on what you're doing. You may require a release form for your guests, depending on what you're doing. Never, ever, 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 never, no matter what anyone tells you, never use copyrighted music in your show. Because the RIAA don't care. They will come after you and they will shut your show down and they will sue you for every penny that you have and then some. So just don't do it. Look for copyright-free music. Make sure that it is copyright-free and make sure that you have a copy of the license such that if you get challenged, you can say, this is the license I used. Again, not a lawyer, so that may not stand up in court, right? What if your guest says something that is illegal? Again, speak to your lawyer. I had a guest on an episode of the .NET-Core podcast who said something he shouldn't have done, got himself into trouble, but not me. I didn't know and I could prove that I didn't know, so it wasn't my problem. To put it bluntly, but you have to be able to prove that, right? So that's the important bit, is get legal advice. What about getting guests on? Occasionally, you're going to want to have someone else on the show, some new voice, some extra opinion, right? Well, how do you get them? I'd start by looking on social media. Almost everyone has a Twitter or a Facebook now, right? Usually on Twitter profiles for famous people, it'll usually say media inquiries and then an email address, or media inquiries and a third party. Contact them through the third party. Don't just poke at someone on social media and go, hey, I want you to be on my podcast. I've had 2 episodes and you're really famous. Never going to happen. Or very unlikely to happen. Some folks have an agent. Try and find out who that agent is and reach out to them, because their agent is hired to work as a go-between between them and everyone else. I'll also have an FAQ. I have one, and there's a link to it on this screen here. There is a link to it on the final slide as well, because that can help people who maybe don't know what podcasting is. You can write a little bit about what podcasting is. You can talk about your process. You can talk about the editing process. You can talk about whether you offer a early version of the episode so that they can proof it or something. That is the link on this slide is the link to my podcast FAQ. Feel free to clone it. Feel free to change it if you want. Well, your version of it, not mine. and yeah, use that if you like, or use that as a starting point. Because we have such limited time for this, and because there are so many other wonderful people who want to talk about the subjects that they want to talk about, I'm going to kind of have to leave it there. We can pause to take some questions in a moment, and if we don't get around to doing that, definitely check me out over on Twitter or any of those places. You'll see a bunch of links on the next slide. I'm pointing in the wrong direction. Next slide. There's also my Twitter account here underneath my face, which is .NET Core Show. Please get in touch if you want some more directed advice, or maybe I can direct you at someone who can give you more directed advice. With that being said, here are a bunch of links to some of the stuff that we've covered, the slide deck, the FAQ, some of the shows I talked about, my 2 Twitter accounts. The DMs on those accounts are wide open, so please feel free to send me any messages that you want, and I will answer them in any way that I can. If it means I send you off to someone else, then I send you off to someone else. Or if it means I go and get you that information and come back to you, I will get that information and come back to you. There was a whole bunch of information that I wanted to cover that I didn't get to because I'm running out of time. But thank you ever so much for taking the time to sit and listen to me talk about podcasting, about the lessons I've learnt, the things that have gone wrong, the things that have gone right. Thank you ever so much to NE-RPC for arranging it all, and thank you to them for choosing to have me give a talk. And just thank you, everyone. If you do end up setting up a show, contact me on one of those 2 Twitter accounts and I'll give it a listen, because I'm always looking for more podcasts to listen to. I'm one of these power listeners who listens to loads. Anyway, with that being said, thank you ever so much, and I'll see you again later.